I have shared before that a lot of times the way the liturgical calendar and actually the 3-year cycle of readings is organized is that the church is very intentional on most Sundays about connecting the theme of the gospel or a theme in the gospel with the theme of the first reading. Today it's from the Old Testament, right? They try to be very intentional about the pairing of the Old Testament and the gospel readings, and then oftentimes the second reading sequentially goes through or is chosen kind of by going through different letters of Paul or other New Testament writings, so that you have the first reading and the gospel reading connecting, and then the second reading kind of disconnected in a sense, so it may or may not relate to the same themes. In today's second reading, it does kind of line up with the first part of the gospel reading, where we learn that those who find their life will lose it, but those who lose their life for my sake will find it. Paul is talking in the second reading about baptism and how we've died with Christ to rise to newness of life, where we lose our life to find it through the sacrament of baptism. But since the church is being intentional about trying to connect the theme in the first reading with the gospel reading, I wanted to spend some time on that theme, on the importance, as we see in that first reading, of hospitality. The importance of how we welcome others, how we are really making a space for them, how we are creating an environment to receive them as Jesus was received. You know, the gospel reading theme is that whoever receives you receives me, and whoever receives me receives the one who sent me. And specifically to the first reading, whoever receives a prophet because he is a prophet will surely receive a prophet's reward, right? So what is hospitality? I thought really one of the examples of hospitality that started to kind of shine in my life really happened when I first entered seminary. So I went to seminary first in 1996. Everybody say that was a long time ago. In 1996, and when I went, I was a little naive about what life in the seminary was like. So I had just gotten out of the Air Force, and I had a 3-bedroom home in Warrensburg, Missouri, and I'd gotten rid of most of the furniture, but I'd taken all of the possessions from a 3-bedroom home to Mom's house, and she couldn't wait to get them out. And so when I went to seminary, I had a 4-door white Mercury Sable packed to the ceiling with stuff, and then I towed behind my car a 5-foot by 8-foot U-Haul, right? That was also packed with stuff. I was moving into a 12-foot by 17-foot room. I didn't know, right? I didn't know anything about that. So I packed up, I loaded up, I drove the 10 hours to Washington, D.C. with that. It says you're only supposed to go 45 miles an hour. I didn't follow that rule. And I got there, and the seminary had a team of people who were the orientation team that were there to welcome the new seminarians. So they were the seminarians who were returning, some of them, that were on the orientation team. And I pulled in with my U-Haul and my full car, and I was thinking, this is going to take a couple hours for me to take multiple trips upstairs to my room and get all this stuff out of here. And this team of seminarians showed up. They really didn't say anything negative about the amount of stuff I brought. And within 20 minutes, they'd unloaded the car and unloaded the U-Haul and helped me get on the way to the U-Haul place to turn it in, right? That this kind of happened in the effort of all of those seminarians to make me feel like I belonged, that I was part of that community. I realized later they were amazed. Like, what is this guy doing? What is he thinking? I understood that later, but at the time, I just thought they were wonderful. So much so that in the future, I served on the orientation team and ran the orientation team because of how I had experienced that hospitality when I had first arrived, right? I think hospitality can be a powerful force in our lives. And we're called to be hospitable. Sometimes we think of that as additional to other important things in the faith, but really, throughout the scriptures, we're called to welcome the stranger. Hospitality, in fact, comes from two words that mean love, stranger, right? To be open to the other. We're also encouraged to be open to each other. The scripture says, Paul says, without grumbling, right? We're called to welcome one another, to be hospitable to each other, to try to meet each other's needs, to go outside of ourselves and build that awareness. And there's a couple of things I'd like to share about hospitality that I think are central to that virtue. The first is that to be hospitable, we have to be present, right? On Saturday evenings, oftentimes we're hearing confessions when people are coming to confession, and so we don't get out to greet people as early. But I remember when I was young and in college, somebody had told me, they were a pastor of a Protestant church. They said 95% of the time, the church is empty. When the people are in the church, be with the people, right? It's why we greet before Mass. It's why we greet after Mass. It's why we try to be present with folks, to be hospitable. But to be present, sometimes we have to show up, right? We've got to be there. We have to go out of our own ways. And we can create our own little worlds through our busy schedules, and we cannot be inconvenienced by anyone else, right? But we're called to go out, to be present to others. I'm also an introvert, and so I need downtime. So I love being with people, and then I love being away from people, right? I need that, because if I don't get that, even when I'm with people, I'm not with them. I'm not present. I can't be fully there with them, right? And so sometimes we have an emotional blockage. When we're present, it doesn't just mean physically, but that we are there with the other. With the other. So we have to be present to be hospitable. The second thing is that we have to make space. In the first reading, we hear that explicitly, right? Elisha has met this woman of influence who they start having dinner when he comes into town, and then she said, what can we do? And so they build a room on the second floor of their house with a table and a chair and a lamp and a bed, so that when he comes to town, he has a place to go, right? We should think of that interiorly for us, that we make space for the other, for those who are different than us, for those who are not normally part of our circle, our families, all of our close friends, or our community, that we create a space where we welcome others, or where they can feel like they belong, right? Sometimes that's positive action for us. Sometimes that's a deep interior attitude that we need to change, that we need to open our hearts for that, so that we can make that space. And then the third one is that we have to listen. Recently heard Archbishop Shelton talking about listening and how important listening is. And he said, really, what we need to do when we try to listen, if we're listening to someone, is we have to listen with the possibility of changing our minds or changing our hearts. If not, we're just waiting to talk, right? It doesn't mean we have to have our minds changed or we have to have our hearts changed, but we have to listen with the possibility of changing our hearts or our minds. That's only true listening. And so when we listen to the others, we are attentive to them, to their needs, to their wants and desires and joys and pains and sorrows, all that's going on. So to be hospitable, we have to be willing to be changed, and we have to pay attention to the other. We're called to Christian hospitality. It is a powerful force in our community because so much of the time now we are disconnected. And hospitality allows us to make connections beyond our normal circles, and to be there for others who need to make a connection so that they can belong. And in that belonging, know that they are loved and loved by God. Hospitality is an expression for us in our community, in our own lives, in our homes, of God's love for others. It's one of the ways in which God has welcomed us into his family. And it really requires, if we're going to be able to make that space, if we're going to be able to be attentive and listen, if we're going to be able to do that, this is the first theme: to die to ourselves so that we can live in newness of life. It requires a transformation of our hearts so that we can live in that love and offer that hospitality to others. May the gospel reading in this Eucharist inspire us to go out of ourselves, to be present to others, to really be there to offer that hospitality, to help others to belong so that they know that they are loved. God has done that for us. Let us go and do likewise.